So, can you, so what are some ways that, how does Riverwise enable Detroit community members to tell their own story on the issue of water?
Well, one of the things that Riverwise is doing is we're of course always encouraging subscription, or not subscription, well, we encourage subscriptions too, but submissions. We'd like people to just send their stories. But one of the things we've discovered is many community people would like help in telling their own story. Now, the convention is that you would go and interview people. But what we're trying to do instead is give people the support to advance their own storytelling capabilities. So we've created a series of workshops, and we held something like 30 of them last year, where we go into various community settings and we take people who are good writers, who have some experience in helping others learn to write, and they conduct workshops, writing workshops. And you'll see in this current issue of Riverwise, there are both reflections on the teaching process in those workshops, and also some writing that has come out of them. And sometimes these are workshops on how do you do fact-finding, how do you do storytelling, how about poetry, how about fiction, how about talking about life developments. There's all different approaches that we're using. But when you start reaching out into community settings, you get people who come and who write and who begin to tell their stories in their own voice. And of course we still use interviews and do that sort of thing, because not everybody wants to go through the process of telling their own story. But you do want to make that the primary emphasis, that people should be able to frame their own life in their own voice and their own perceptions on their own terms. And Riverwise has really been dedicated to doing that. So that's the primary way we do it.
Excuse me, sorry.
So, tell me a little bit more about how the Boggs Center, or perhaps you personally as a community organizer, how do you engage and reach out to all of the different other organizations and nonprofits and community groups who are also trying to address this issue of water?
Of water? Well, the primary way any of us reach out to anybody is we show up. And I think the main thing about organizing is showing up, being there. If there's a demonstration, be there. If there's a conference, be there. If there's a concert to raise money, be there. If you can't be there, send money. If you can't send money, send more people. Whatever way to support those ongoing activities. So our main way of supporting this is to show up when we can, participate when we can, make it as known as wide as we can about events happening, and being there. That's the only way I know to organize in the city. I think that the water struggle has shifted somewhat with this. Hopefully we'll begin to see some changes in terms of the city policies. So I'm actually pretty hopeful about that.
What gives you the best hope?
Well, my best hope would be that the city would create a water affordability plan and begin to systematically not only make sure everybody has water, but to systematically restore the infrastructure, which personally, I'm not just personally, I think anybody who looks at this for even half a minute realizes we are living on borrowed time with the infrastructure that we've got. We are close to a dire collapse of systems that are so old that they cannot continue to function. I mean, some of these aren't just 50 years old, some of these are almost 100 years old. There are places in the city that are carrying sewage and carrying water through wooden lines. I mean, this is not a sustainable pathway to the future. So my best hope is that we would begin a serious infrastructure replacement process. You know, Flint has had to do that out of emergency circumstance. We should be able to do it out of forethought.
Is that documented somewhere, the wooden lines? Because I've heard that.
Well, the reason you've heard it, the place I heard it was when they were putting the queue line in front of the public library, and they were digging down to put those fiber cables in, and they hit the wooden line. So that's the story I heard. Now, where I heard that, I have no idea at this point.
Okay.
But it's not hard to imagine, because those are very old buildings, and those streets haven't been dug up in a very long time. They were simply paved over. So why would they not be?
So what happens at a public demonstration? You know, since part of our goal is to you know, we're doing myth busting over here, right? And so for most people who have never felt the need to protest or demonstrate, the idea of a public demonstration can seem very radical. What actually happens in one of these public demonstrations?
Well, it should be radical, and people should think about whether or not they want to do that. But historically, the primary way to get powers that be to shift is to have bodies on the street. Now, bodies on the street don't guarantee anything, and bodies on the street generally do not mean any sort of dangerous activity. Most demonstrations include mothers with babies in strollers and elders in wheelchairs. They are all kinds of people, but there are people who are saying it's important that we be counted collectively to show the powers that be what we want, what we think is right, what we think is worth at least committing some of our time and energy to. So public demonstrations are just that. They are the public demonstrating what they think is correct. And generally, the best way to do that is not by sending, you know, signing a little internet petition. It's showing up. Now, sometimes, if showing up doesn't do anything, people will escalate those demonstrations to create larger inconveniences, especially because it should be quite obvious to everyone that that public demonstrations are so threatening, the media rarely covers them. All you have to do is look at the Poor People's Campaign of just this most recent year. You know, 18 was acknowledging the 50-year anniversary from '68, and there were over 40 states that participated in weekly demonstrations, and I don't think I saw more than 2 film clips in mainstream media about any of those demonstrations, even though they happened for 40 days. So the absence of coverage is a problem. But also, I think the willingness of the corporate power structure to isolate those demonstrations from each other is a tactic that they have refined since the 60s. But I think that tactic is losing power because of the power of social media. More and more people are going to demonstrations and sharing those on social media, and they're demystifying the idea that this is somehow a crazy or dangerous thing. It is your right as a citizen. More importantly, it is your responsibility as a citizen to demonstrate for what you want. So come, it's fun.
I'm glad you mentioned the Poor People's Campaign, because that is one campaign which is also really showing its connections to water affordability as
they've been
well.
yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that one?
Well, I haven't been involved in this one at all, other than to speak at its beginning. I was involved in the last one, the first one, but this one has been, like the last one, has been very much supported by welfare rights, and welfare rights is a major part of the People's Water Board. And the Poor People's Campaign has taken a strong stand on water affordability and water as a human right and as a sacred trust. And I think Reverend Barber has spoken about this several times. He's been to Flint, he's been to Detroit, he's talked about water. So it's a part of what the national landscape is pushing in terms of just because people are poor does not mean they should not have access to these basic responsibilities of life, which food, water, housing, education, the capacity to live a life of some dignity.
So, going back to your reflections about, the water shutoffs after bankruptcy concluded, are there any particular instances, whether in terms of resistance moments or whether in terms of helping communities that stand out to you, that motivate you, that still guide your thinking?
Well, I think there's no question but Charity Hicks's life and death and her call to wage love has been central to everybody's fight around the water struggle. I think Valerie Jean's testimony at the People's Tribunal, where we tried Governor Snyder and the emergency managers on human rights violations, her testimony about standing on top of her shutoff valve and saying, no, you're not going to shut this off, is certainly something that we should all look to as a source of inspiration. I think Kate Levy's work around documenting all of the forms of resistance and all of the forms of creativity and resilience and the ways people have tried to respond to the water crisis is really important. I think Tawana Petty and Monica Lewis-Patrick's presentation, almost every time they get a chance to speak about water, is to talk about how when they were distributing water in the neighborhood, one of the things they saw were hoses running from one house to the other, where people who could afford water and had not been shut off were sharing with others. I think of the nun who told me that she'd been doing laundry and sharing her bathroom with her next door neighbor for 2 years because they were people who could not keep their water on, but they were able to depend on her as a source of water. I think talking with teachers who have had to do this dance of not acknowledging that they know children without water, because to do that means they have to report the family to protective services, because to not have water is a form of neglect on the part of the parent and put your children at risk. So I have teachers who say, we can't acknowledge this, but we've all sort of decided, let's just come early and open the gym and the showers. I mean, that kind of, so those are moments that stand out to me. I think the testimony by the UN was really critical. I think the other thing that stands out are the international water gatherings, where the very first one, I think we had 40 states, maybe 49 states. It was I can't remember the exact number now, but it was a demonstration of the clear recognition on the part of people who are living in community that water is something we need to pay attention to. So that certainly stands out. And I think the delivery of bottles of water to Detroit by the indigenous community in Canada and by the coal miners in Appalachia who had experienced living without water because of pollution are important images for me, to see the connection of people recognizing that when governments fail you, you still have people you can count on to help you through whatever that crisis is. And that's not usually an image you see in the mainstream. So I have a lot of great images, actually.
Was there a particular experience that you were there in the moment of it that stands out for you, whether in terms of delivering water or whether in terms of being a part of a collaborative?
Well, pretty much all of the above that I just talked about. The interesting thing to me is the number of young people who stepped up to deliver water in the neighborhoods. There were a lot of young people who said, yeah, I'll do this. And if you look at, every now and again you get a call from Monica that, or from Deb, from We the People, that there's been a truck, or there's a truck on the way. Could you show up for the morning? Typically, you can count on 15 to 20 people to show up. Some of them are 12 and 13, some of them are 80, and people just make a line and they put the water in and they store it and get sure it's in a place so it can go out. So, I mean, I think all of those are real signs of how people are who are responding to a crisis in ways that say, how can I help, rather than how can I make money.
How did you first get involved with the People's Water Board?
Oh, gee, I don't know. I mean, they've been around, it feels like forever. But I don't know if the Boggs Center was formally a member before the bankruptcy water shutoffs. I think when the bankruptcy water shutoffs started happening, a call went out from the water board, you know, let's be sure we're all members kind of thing, as a way to strengthen that organization. So I think the Boggs Center signed up, just as did many other organizations at that moment, out of the crisis. But I mean, they've been around a very long time, and you may not know, this is a whole other saga, but during the Detroit Future fiasco, that was a foundation-funded shrinking of Detroit, so-called community engagement, terrible process. During that, one aspect was to create a community conversation around environmental justice questions. And what happened is environmental justice organizations stepped into the vacuum of real leadership and said, we will set the parameters and host a conversation around environmental questions. And you guys from the city and the foundations can come and listen to what's happening. So, and that could be a long story in and of itself. But so I went to the environmental justice. But here's a vivid memory of Lila, whose memorial is tomorrow. The meeting was organized by various topics: land justice, air, water. So I went to the water justice one, and somebody from the city, from the water department, was there, very nervous, obviously expecting to be yelled at. And Lila reached over and touched this guy's knee and said, you can relax. We're not here to yell at you. We're here to make sure you understand water is a human right and a sacred trust. And that's what people talked about in the circle. And so Lila set that up. I may tell this story tomorrow, actually, at her memorial, because I hadn't thought of it until just now. But that was way before shutoffs, way before any of this incredible community activity. And by then, the environmental justice community was already clear about a perspective on water. And they were thinking of ways to make that enacted. And as you know, as early as 2005, nearly a decade before the water shutoffs, the People's Water Board had advocated for, the members of the People's Water Board had advocated for the creation of the water affordability resolution, which was adopted by the City Council. So that is a long-standing push, and that's come from the People's Water Board. I mean, I think they should be given all the credit for that notion as an important thing, and it's a long-standing notion in the city.
I'm glad you brought up Mama Lila because we will be there tomorrow. And I want to ask you if there's, well, you just mentioned one really important and useful experience, but is there something else about Mama Lila that you want to talk about, maybe in terms of her impact on you, or something about her that you will always cherish forever, or her role in the broader water struggle?
Well, I'm not, what I said at her funeral service is something I would not want to get lost, and I think it's something that I'm one of the few people left who know of this. During the first Gulf War under Bush the First, there was a lot of organizing, of course, against opposing that. But at the same time, there were a group of young men. They were called the Lost Boys of Somalia. And these were young men who had been displaced by war, who had traveled, I think, 1,000 miles in African desert mostly, without shoes. They had looked after one another. They ranged from about age, the oldest was maybe 16, the youngest was maybe 9, 10. It was quite an age range. And these boys had gotten themselves to some UN center, and the only name they knew was Rosa Parks. They had known about Rosa Parks. And they, so somebody in the UN contacted the Rosa Parks Institute and wanted these young men to be able to be placed in the United States because they had nowhere to go, really. And Lila said, send them here, we'll look after them. And that was an act of tremendous courage to take these kids. But what she then did, along with the Boggs Center, which wasn't the Boggs Center then, but along with us, but what she did was say, let's hold an open teen forum where these boys can tell their story about what war really means to people. And that's what we did. We held a big forum. It was in the Martin Luther King Center, sponsored by Rosa Parks, and at that time, I think it was Detroiters for Dignity and We the People and So Sad. And we brought all these young people together, and it began with each of these boys describing their experience of war. And that was an act of extraordinary courage and extraordinary commitment to a different way of thinking about how we should live. So that's a story that I very much value from her.
Thank you so much. I guess I'm just going to close with this. So water shutoffs, unfortunately, are not unique in the sense that, you know, we've seen them happen in other cities, and they are still happening in Detroit as well. So in that broader context, I guess, what makes what's happening over here special, perhaps? And I don't mean that in a positive way, obviously, but so how would you basically think of Detroit's water shutoffs over here, given the fact that unfortunately other cities also shut off connections to their residents? Are we a vanguard of sorts? Is this where the resistance begins? Is this where we start saying that no, this should not be common policy, so to speak? What is the broader implication of Detroit's water shutoffs in the context of really what's happening around the world?
Well, I think the broadest implication is that probably within 15 years, studies are saying that as much as half the global population may not have access to affordable, safe water. Now, we need to stop and think about that. What does that mean for all of our lives? If you can afford water or if you can't afford water, it's like, what kind of world would that be? And is that the direction we want to head, where only some people get water and others don't? If we're headed that direction, we know we are talking about a world of greater violence, greater force, greater inequity. And what Detroit is offering is to say, wait a minute, there are alternatives. We can figure out ways to equitably, thoughtfully, and imaginatively make sure everybody's looked after. Now, it might mean we can't water our golf courses. It might mean that we can't all have a swimming pool. But it might mean everybody can be guaranteed a life of dignity. And that's what's behind the water affordability plan. That's what's behind this notion of water as a sacred trust. And other cities have recognized that. Philadelphia, Baltimore have both adopted water affordability plans based on the Detroit research and model. So we're offering a perspective that will help us move to a future that is more equitable, that does recognize our responsibilities. And that's why I think Detroit, I mean, you use the word vanguard. Certainly Detroit, because we were one of the first cities to be shaped by the brutality of industrial life, we're one of the first places to also then be abandoned by industrial life. And that gives us an advantage, that we've had a longer period of time to think about what are the questions then of how to create life for everybody. How do we do this if you don't have corporate money behind you? And so we've got lots of answers.
Thank you.